is very important for me in my work, but I think for every luthier, it's essential, I think.
I had a great time chatting with today's guest. I can't wait to visit his shop one of these days soon. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are talking today with Bram De Man, who is a double bass luthier in Brussels, Belgium, and started off on the bass, studied luthiery, got really into researching the D-violone, early double basses, and all kinds of cool stuff like that. Definitely check out his website to learn more. We talk about this. We talk about life in general. We had just a great, deep conversation, my favorite type of conversation, what the pandemic has been like, the joys and mysteries of building these instruments, and much more. Quick shout out to our sponsors, Upton Bass, Trumpet Labs, and Dorico. More on them in a bit. But let's get into this conversation with the great Bram De Man. How's your day going?
Fine, how's yours?
Nice, good. Just starting my morning, got my strong coffee here, and
Wonderful. Hey, I hope this sounds all right like this, or would you like it different?
No, you sound fine. Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for inviting me. It's great.
For sure. I love talking with luthiers, and I do it far too infrequently. I'm actually doing a chat later today. There's this International Society of Bassists. They have this Build-A-Bass event, and I don't know how they're doing it this year because it's virtual, but I'm talking to a couple of these American luthiers that are involved. So we're doing that later this afternoon here, so it'll be fun.
Great. I really love it. It's Trevor Davis, Mitch Mirring, who else is in there? It's really a great group of bass makers that all join up for this bass. I love it. I think it's great.
It's been fun to see because I've been at the past few conventions and gone in to see everybody working together. You have some great, like Trevor Davis is a luthier here that makes great. It's fun to see Trevor, just like putting in a neck or sanding some corners or this and that. And yeah, it's pretty cool to check all that out.
Yeah, I like it too. It's great way they work is the concept of making an instrument with different, or at least, so to speak, multiple luthiers. Mm-hmm. It's something I really appreciate because you can put a lot of effort in it, a lot of personality, but great craftsmanship as well. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I find always the nicest thing to see, working together, a good clear view and some good craftsmanship. That's wonderful, right?
Yeah, it's wonderful, and it's one of those things that luthiers seem to really enjoy it because I know that so much of your work tends to be solitary. You're like, and I think people like that. But I've really enjoyed seeing some of these gatherings of luthiers. They have here in the States the Oberlin Violin Society of America, their bass workshop. I was at their bass workshop in 2018, and it was really cool to see 20 luthiers. There were a few people out of the United States. I think it's different from year to year, mostly U.S. people for that one, but just to see everybody getting together and showing how different wood affects, they would show what they were working on. Everybody would bring a bass, and it's just really cool to see everybody learning from each other.
Definitely. I think that's the best thing because it's a profession where there's lots of secrecy, so to speak, or at least there used to be, or there still is, to be honest. But these kind of events, I think they're great. I mean, personally, I like to discuss everything with everybody. So especially when it comes to bass making, I think you only win if you share your secrets, right? I mean, in the end, what's a secret?
Exactly. And I think that's what's so cool to see with these bass makers. And maybe it sounds like that's starting to change in luthiery in general, but certainly bass players, I think maybe when bass luthiers were just maybe a little more open and sharing just in general. But yeah, no, you're only going to benefit by sharing what you're working on. And it's cool to see some of these makers, like it gets pretty nerdy at this Oberlin event. They actually put together PowerPoint presentations and show. I was watching, I believe Greg Smith is the luthier here in the States. He put one together called Thoughts on Wood, and everybody's sitting around and he's going through the slides and everybody's taking notes. And I thought, like, how cool. That's sort of like what you would hope that a profession would do, is get together and learn, because that's like what doctors do. That's what many professions do. And it's just, it's cool to see luthiers coming together like that.
Yeah. But I like it too because there are so many little parts that come in play when it's about making a musical instrument, and each of these parts can be studied. And each of these parts can demand years of experience or can demand years of study, research. And the fact that there are also academical researchers working on these things, not only craftsmen, but really physicists and all these people that have theory background on a level that I cannot imagine. That's wonderful. And also when it comes, because making an instrument is great, but without a musician, it's only a box with strings. So then working with musicians to see what they can take with it, how they can bring it to the next level and to work in a conversation, that's, in my work at least, essential.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just so cool to see how open-minded the luthiers I've been around at least are. At that VSA bass workshop in 2018, the Anima Nova, the carbon fiber sound post, Paul Molnar, they're your neighbors practically. They were there and they had a bass there and they had and I think we spent about 3 hours putting the sound post in, and Diana Gannett, this wonderful bass player here in the States, was playing a bass that she's actually an amateur luthier. She had built a bass, and so they put the sound post in and adjusted it a little bit tighter, and we were all listening to how the bass changed. And then we had another bass player playing some jazz on the bass to see how it was affected with pizzicato. And it's really interesting whether or not that's a direction someone wants to go. It's just cool to see the openness and the experimentation and just seeing innovations like that.
Exactly, especially when you think about it, the concept of the Anima Nova sound post, it's extremely well designed. I mean, I have to say it. It's really, when you think that it used to be a wooden stick, and they took all this effort to design a wonderful, extremely well functioning device to use in the same way. That the concept alone fits in with the theory you said about going into detail and working with that. I think it's just great. It's really wonderful.
Well, that innovation in particular, I think, is so useful for bassists in climates where there's a lot of variability, or if you're traveling, and just the practicality of swapping out a sound post and just really being able to dial it in exactly to it was remarkable what these small adjustments, the tonal impact that it would have. It was really cool to see.
Sure, yeah, it's great, and it's so surprising. I mean, because for me, when I make a wooden sound post, of course, it always depends on a bass, but I have a starting position, right? Because you have to have a frame to work with. And I have the starting position, this starting tension that I feel in my sound post setter. I say, okay, that's how I like it standard. And then the way to adjust, but with some basses, especially because basses are non-standardized, as you know, with some basses, it can be surprising how off of the standard, so to say, the sound post ends up to have this maximum sound, or the optimum playability, or the optimum difference between bass and treble. That for me, something like the Anima Nova was a great learning curve, a great learning experience. It's something I still use very often, but just the concept of being able to try it out on so many different levels is extraordinary to me.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad to design it.
Yeah, no, it's been great. We were playing around here in the San Francisco Bay Area we had 3 different basses. You can probably see my bass in the corner there. That's a 1995 Albert Jackstad bass, so fairly contemporary bass. And then we had a Jusek that someone had set up mainly as actually he plays everything on it, but a great jazz bass. And then we had this Busan and the Anima Nova and the 2 different lengths of post, and we're just experimenting with that and wood posts. And this was right before the pandemic. This is maybe fall of 2019, and it was really fun to see how and I'm one of those people that once I get my bass set, I'm just so concerned. If it sounds good, I don't want to mess with it. And living here in San Francisco, the humidity and temperature are so consistent that once you get a good setup, you're good. I mean, it really doesn't change much. But it was so fascinating to get in there and see how different we did some adjustments, and the bass register on this bass just went away. And then we there was one setting with, I think it was with the Anima Nova. It was so bizarre, but we got it where the bass sounded good, but the effect that my vibrato had on the bass, it like muted the vibrato somehow. I do not understand the physics behind that at all, and neither did the luthier Pat McCarthy who was working on the bass. But it was like, how weird is that we can play around with this? It's like this black magic kind of thing, and remove vibrato from the sound if we choose.
But there are these things, man, because I'm a skepticist, not in my personal life, but in my profession. And I mean this in a positive way. It's just that I like to experience things for myself. And because you hear all these theories around, especially when I was still in school, when I didn't know anything about instrument making, there are all these wild concepts. And when you don't know anything about it, of course, you believe them all at first. And then you end up with very strange things. But so I'm a skepticist because of that. But for instance, the effect that an end pin can have on the sound, that's also something that really is something to keep in mind. Because it's something so quick so easily adjustable, but with such an impact. The differences in metal, the differences in length, multiple systems. I'm sure you know the Francois Rabat, the angled end pin, all these concepts. I mean, it never ends. It just doesn't stop. I mean, and that's only a small part, right? That's just the end pin. So we've now talked about the end pin, we've talked about the sound post, and then there's the top plate, the thicknesses. I mean, it keeps on going.
I am so proud to have my course with Discover Double Bass, Beginner's Classical Bass, out in the world. This was a long time coming, friends, and this course is designed, as the name implies, for beginner bassists who want to learn how to play classical music, or for more experienced players who wish to revisit the foundations of technique. The course is comprised of 66 lessons over 4 hours and covers a wide range of topics on classical bass, which will make a real difference to you playing. It is the perfect course for beginners. I feel weird saying that since it's my course, but I definitely believe in it, to build a solid foundation of double bass technique and to help you feel confident playing. Many of the lessons include transcriptions of the pieces, exercises, and etudes, so you have everything you need to practice at home. I spent hundreds of hours putting this together over the last few years. I'm so glad to see it out in the world. We have a link to it in the show notes, or just visit discoverdoublebase.com/Jason Heath. This episode is brought to you by Dorico, and one of the things that attracted me so much to this app is the beautiful user interface. Here's Daniel Spreadbury, Senior Product Manager, on how they thought about designing this user interface.
It was building on that idea of having everything in its place and a place for everything, basically, and not just throwing everything at the screen and hoping that you'd be able to find your way through it.
I have become a true fan of Dorico. I have the full version. I use it every single day. I use it in my lessons. I use it for... I have become such a fan of Dorico. I use it every single day. I use it in my lessons. I use it for making arrangements and exercises and everything like that. There is a free version, SE, Dorico SE, and you can do everything practically that the full version of the software lets you do. So if you're doing arrangements for a student, duets, or anything like that, or exercises, that is perfect for you. Dorico.com will take you to their page on Steinberg's website, and I can't say enough good things about them. Thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Oh, I know. It's so interesting. And especially something like the end pin, which is one of the easiest things to test out, because you just take it out and put a different one in, or maybe a little more work if you put in an angled end pin. It's a company here in the States, New Harmony, Mark Salter. He's been making these carbon fiber and different material end pins, and it's remarkable, the sound difference, and then also the player experience. There's this really cool device. My friend Diego Zacharias, he's in A Coruña, Spain, or he's in Galicia. He's the principal bass of the orchestra there. It's this rock stop essentially, but it's made of some sort of aircraft metal that brings the bass off the ground, and it gives this resonance. And I swear, sometimes you play around with something and you just think you're hearing something because you want to hear it, difference. But I swear, I've tried this with several of his basses, and there was this extra something that it was adding to the sound. I don't know what, and maybe I was just fooling myself, but I need to pick up, and I've forgotten the name of the device, of course. I need to pick one up and play around.
Yeah, definitely. But that's also something of high importance, I think, as a musician. When it works for you, even though it's just psychological or magical, so to say, as long as it works, it works. So that's that. I mean, you must know it as a musician. When you have a bad day or you woke up and you didn't feel like it was gonna go, then it's not gonna go. But when you're in the mood to play, or when you get in the mood to make the music, then it goes.
Yeah.
So I think if it only helps that amount, but that's just the amount you need, well, then you're there, right?
For sure. Yeah, those little things. There are so many fascinating things about the instruments in general, but the double bass in particular, like strings and now sometimes if we get extreme and we're using either unwound gut versus spirochords, or some of the differences I think are quite different from the listener perspective too. But I think a lot of strings, the differences kind of fade away a bit as you get away from the instrument. It's kind of, you hear the instrument and you're not hearing the difference between spirochord versus belcan or versus, I don't know, whatever, D'Addario, but I think the feeling under the player's fingers and that player experience, that is quite different with strings. And so they end up playing differently because they experience the strings differently. And again, I think there are more extremes, or the Gensler's strings, I think they're now called tempura strings. I think that some of those like really are objectively different, but a lot of the time, if I have these D'Addario Kaplans on and I put on Parastro perpetuals, I mean, they're Parastro, whatever, Flexicor Deluxe, they're almost the same string, but just those subtle differences do feel different under your fingers.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely important. Of course, for many musicians, it's not that easy to try out because strings cost a lot of money. I mean, you surely know that. But I mean, for me as an instrument maker, I do feel that there are certain strings where I know that, okay, these will work well for you. But it's true, as you say, as an experienced musician, when you know your instrument, you can play on all sorts of strings. That's not a point anymore. Yeah. But I do find it very, very good that, for instance, when a student walks in, and who's playing on these extremely hard strings with a setup, of course, a kilometer. I'm in Europe, a kilometer high. Then it's a pleasure. Then it's pleasant, and I can say, take these light strings; they'll suit you better. But with some tension, it helps just to work for the musician at least. But when it comes to speaking about strings, a couple of years ago, I was making gut strings for violone back then, so D-violone, and I was reading in these old treatises. Treatises.
Yeah, sure. Treatises. Yeah,
something like that. About string making, and interestingly enough, when I calculated the strings I would need for tension and length and all of these aspects and diameter, I came up with measurements that looked so far from each other, so wide apart. So the thinnest string would be like 1.2 millimeters, and the thickest would be about 7 millimeters. I don't know how much it is in inches, but it's quite a difference.
Yeah.
And when I was before I started making them, I thought this is never going to work, because how is a string of 7 millimeters thick? It's almost a centimeter thick. How is this going to vibrate freely without a disturbing sound, or without not working under the bow or anything, in the same manner as this 1.1 or 1.6 millimeter string is going to do? But then when I was making, I just made a very big batch of these strings with different methods and different ways of treating the gut, different guts as well, because that's a. Are you a vegetarian, Jason?
No, I'm not. Yeah.
Well, in the profession of instrument making, it's a very. You better not be a vegetarian because you work with all these animals.
I've heard, yeah.
Anyway, when working with guts to make gut strings, that's literally what it is, right? But in the end, I did manage to make a set that works completely fine. So I was so surprised that these strings, so six string D-violone, each string was, for me, when I made them, so different that I had no idea it's going to work. But still, when it was tuned up, tensioned up on the instrument, there was no difference in feel whatsoever. They both all perfectly well. In the end, not in the beginning, in the end, after all of that experiments. But that was a big surprise for me because I never expected that would work.
The whole gut string world is so fascinating to me. It's something that I've only dabbled in, playing on other people's basses, but I've had some great conversations about them. John Feeney is a bassist in New York City who plays with a lot of the period music ensembles there. And he has this great video that I think the Handel and I forget the society, one of those early music societies or Orchestra of Age of Enlightenment or something. But he has this wonderful description of the experience of playing on gut. And John plays everything, not just period music, and he plays it all on gut, and he'll tune down the same set and bring it up. And this video, I'll have to dig it up. It's from maybe 6 or 7 years ago, but he just talks about like the worlds within worlds that you get in gut. It's kind of like using the analogy of like turntable and like great vinyl versus digital, and just how much complexity there is to the sound in there. It makes you want to go out and play nothing but gut strings when you hear him describe it.
Yeah. It's a great thing, the gut string world, or the gut string, especially when modern strings, they are really modern when you think about it. Charles Mingus, he played it all on gut, wound gut in the end. But still, let's say, I'm not sure about it, but before the 50s, or at least, were there synthetic strings in the 40s? I don't know.
I think it's all tied. I have to fact check myself, but I think it's all kind of tied into World War II and how everything just became harder to move around and supplies, getting the traditional. I think this is true, if I remember correctly, in instrument making too. Like all of a sudden, getting things from Europe outside became, for obvious reasons, a challenge for a while, and so I think that's out of necessity. I think steel strings started to get adopted, certainly here in the States, and then it just sort of evolved into what people use. But boy, if we look at the history of string playing, gut is like 90% plus of our 500-600 years of what we think of as these instruments, has been on gut.
Definitely. And then the revolution in 1666 with the wound gut string. Mm-hmm. If I'm not mistaken, about a year, but I think I'm right. The wound gut string, there must have been, back in that day, there must have been a great invention. It must have been as revolutionary as the MacBook for us, as I'm using it now. Mm-hmm. For instruments, it must have been really great.
Yeah.
Because imagine that all of a sudden you can reduce your diameter of your string, still keep the tension, keep the same volume, and keep the same tone. Wonderful. I really think it's but I really love the history of all these things, especially how they go together, like what you mentioned now with the World War, and therefore a lack of supplies or the concept of coming up with new inventions, not only in warfare but also in music. Mm-hmm. It's really something I find highly interesting. For instance, the international trades and how the routes around Africa and all these aspects influenced the materials we instrument makers were able to use, or the guilds that were everywhere, the guilds in Italy, the guilds here in Flanders. It's so interesting to see how this influenced everything.
This episode is brought to you by Trumpet Labs. They make hand-built mics out of Portland, Oregon, and they have an excellent mic for upright bass called Nadine. The Nadine is a condenser mic with a clear, natural sound and incredible feedback rejection. This mic is a completely new design. The head mounts in between the strings above the tailpiece with a rubber grommet, and the body securely straps to the tailpiece with Velcro elastic. A 14-inch Mogami cable connects the two parts, making it easy to place on any bass. It's durable and holds up to the demanding needs of the instrument while offering excellent sound quality. Trumpet Labs is offering a free t-shirt just for Contrabass Conversations listeners with the purchase of a mic. Just visit www.eartrumpetlabs.com/contrabass to claim yours and check out the Nadine. How is it that Upton Bass came to design a bass for Gary Carr? Well, it all started with an email. Here's Eric and Gary from Upton Bass on how this happened.
Gary was at kind of the forefront of ergonomics in commissioning different bass makers to make ergonomic models to his playing style. And he basically replied. He said, yeah, but here's what I'm looking for. I want something, that's this, and this.
He sent us sketches.
And by the way, I want it affordable that anyone going to my car camp could afford it.
This model has become so popular, and Gary Carr even played it for the 50th anniversary International Society of Bassists convention. He was the opening, he gave the keynote speech, and he played 2 beautiful selections on his Upton bass, his Carr model Upton bass. Learn more at uptonbass.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Yeah, it's so much more tied up in the politics of the time and just the things that are going on in the world. And I think we sort of forget that when we look back. But then you realize, music and instruments evolved with the times, and people historically have been receptive to new innovations. And just because you might look at like what Mozart was doing in this particular time, well, you have to think about all the other factors. Or what I love is the whole rise of the Viennese double bass and how that was particularly tied into like geography and just like the way that music functioned in these little communities. And I mean, if you just look at, you think like, why the heck did this instrument become so popular in this solo instrument? And then you look at all the factors and you start to understand, but it's quite complicated. Everything's influencing everything else.
Have you read the book Meta Hodos?
Yes. Yes, Cornel Lecomte, your fellow. I believe he lives in Brussels, right?
He was here today. He's a very good friend of mine.
Oh, he is somebody I think the world of him. He's such a fascinating person, and his Viennese tuning YouTube channel, and just that I have been recommending that to so many people because he makes something that can seem quite academic. He makes it very accessible to people. So I've been spreading the word whenever I can about that because I think it's just such a great, and it's sort of like realizing how we're not really sure about anything when we really get down to it and how people did it. We have these documents, I'm just paraphrasing Cornell now, but the more we research, the less we realize we know, I think is kind of one takeaway.
Yeah, but that's something I love so much about him. I mean, he's a truly great guy to start off with, but an exceptional musician. But when it comes to research, he has kept his open mind throughout the years, which enabled him to really keep his vision very broad, extremely wide. So he can make conclusions for himself or for anyone in a discussion that are really well-based. And I truly appreciate it. For instance, just 15 minutes ago, he sent me a mail with a photo of a Mongolian double bass. How is it called? The Ik Hur, but I probably pronounced it wrongly. It's 2 strings, and you don't really, but you do take them in finger positions, but it's more with the fingernails or some way. I don't know how you play it. But he sees that, he knows the instrument, and all of a sudden he thinks, hey, I have a concept for this. Let's try it out. Can we put 3 strings on it? Can we put 5 strings on it? Could you play Sperger on it?
Of course.
That would be too far, but you get the point. He's really great in seeing and connecting all these aspects: politics, geographics, demographics, instrument making, musicology. It's wonderful. It's a joy to work together with such a musician. Truly, it's very inspiring.
Well, what a great person to have in town with you. He's somebody that I think of as just like a great example of a lifelong learner. Like he went back to school after already having a full career playing bass, and that I hope to have, and I just get inspired by musicians like him that are just so curious and continuing to learn. And the more you get in, the more you realize there is to learn. So that's very cool. What a small world.
Definitely, but the complete bass community is the world by itself is pretty small, but the complete bass community is even smaller, obviously. It's like everybody knows everybody, and continents, no matter where. I think that's great. Of course, it's because of the internet for a big part, which I truly appreciate. But I love it, especially because, how it used to be here in Europe, you had the schools in northern Italy, 2 cities, Brescia and Cremona, and the multiple towns further down south. You had a center in France and a center in Germany. And these were so different from each other when it came to how they made instruments, the styles, the methods in general, the ethics as well, not only the aesthetic, but also the ethics. But now I see it, especially on Instagram, for instance. I really love Instagram because it's great that you can share with anyone who you like with or with who you don't like. But anyway, you can share everything where you want an opinion on, or you say, hey, I found this, or I'm doing this, I'm carving a scroll. Do you like it or you don't? And people can react, say, hey, cool, that's in Grancino style, or I don't know what it is, but it's nice. Or I just love it. It brings the community closer together. And for me, that's what we need in music. There have been, especially when the times when I was still in school, you had to have rules like it's like this, and don't think anything more about it. It's just like that because I tell you that it's like that. You need that in school to start somewhere. Otherwise, when you have no base to fall back on, it gets more difficult, I think. But with a solid base like that, you need to develop some way or another a certain curiosity to then really get to the next level and to keep expanding your knowledge and not only ending up with answers on your questions, but definitely with more questions.
It's a
and
great
that's something I like about your podcast, for instance. Congratulations on that.
Oh, well, thanks. It's one of those things I never expected to end up doing, but it's been a wonderful talking about lifelong learning, like Cornell. Like it's been a great self-education. You know, because I've used this line probably too often on the podcast, but like I'd want to chat with you anyway. Like if we're hanging out, and hopefully we'll hang out in person in Brussels or here in San Francisco one of these days, we'd be having this conversation anyway. It'd be pretty much the same conversation. But to be able to put it out in the world is this added benefit, and also like we're just all so busy in life, you know. And though we'd want to have this conversation, the podcast makes it easy to like put it on the calendar, turn off the devices, and it's like it's such a great, in this connected world. It's a great thing, and it's like I could just lie and say I had a podcast and just do this, and I would still get a lot out of it. But it's cool to put it out there, and you know, it's so interesting. What I like to say about my iPhone right there, it's like the best and worst thing that's ever happened to me. But I do think the positives outweigh the negatives for me if I'm smart about it. And like watching people connect, like you're talking about with luthiers on Instagram, or we're seeing this with performers too, and practice channels, and like, hey, here's what I'm working on. I mean, that's such a beautiful thing. And I'm starting to see, I've been doing this sort of thing long enough, as I go to bass conventions, whether it's those wonderful Bass Europe events that I hope happen again, or the ISB here, it's like the connections we've made online, we just continue the conversation in real life. It's like this beautiful thing. I meet people that I've never really met in person, but I feel like I know them as well as people I grew up with. And so it's really, when used correctly, it's just a wonderful learning and connection tool. And it really does make the world feel small.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a beautiful concept. All these conventions as well. I mean, it's just great. Because I mean, it's great. I was happy to have set an alarm for this because if it wasn't in my agenda, I mean, I'm in the workshop right now. So if it wasn't in my agenda, I definitely would have forgot. To be honest, I did forget about it. My apologies. I'm very happy that I was right on time. 5 minutes late, I guess. My apologies. But I wasn't. I was working, and I'm doing this Grunert Quinoa model for the moment, setting up. And yeah, when you're in the flow, you just tend to not get out of the workshop. And therefore keeping it all in, but it's great to have a conversation about it.
Yeah, well, it's one of the, like, I remember talking to Arnold Schnitzer about just the experience of working as a luthier. This is 6 or 7 years ago, probably at this point, but I said, oh, it must be real, because he was in the corporate world and then left to become a luthier, and that's the short version of the story. But I said, oh, it must be really interesting to be working with your hands like that, going from that job. And he said, well, yeah, you're working with your hands, but really you're working with your brain. And I mean, talk about flow, the flow that I see luthiers get in, and luthiers, when they get together, can be quite social, but obviously a lot of your time is just spent problem solving on your own, and it's got to be an incredible state of flow that you get in when you're digging into and solving a puzzle that so many of these non-standardized instruments must pose.
Definitely, yeah, sure. But for me, it's also something that, I don't know, when I'm doing a fingerboard, for instance, when I'm dressing a fingerboard, the way my plane works, it really becomes an extension of my body. Mm-hmm. And it's a sort of geometry that comes by itself, because I think how it's going to be in my hands, manage to do what I think some way. I mean, this sounds esoterical, but when I have to explain it, that's about how it works for me. And I'm pretty sure I can dress a fingerboard while having a conversation about yogurt or about anything else that has nothing to do with basses, because now it's one motion. But the time it took to get to that stage was countless fingerboards of real focusing and leave me alone, anyone, just to get it there. So it's true what you say about flow. Flow is very important for me in my work, but I think for every luthier, it's essential, I think.
It's always so interesting for me how people get into the profession too, because it's something that I think it's safe to, at least with the luthiers I've chatted, they usually didn't start out at 9 years old saying, I'm going to be a double bass luthier. It's usually a circuitous path. Oftentimes there's playing involved. I have yet to meet a double bass luthier that doesn't play double bass too. So, but it's just so cool. And I've read, and you have a bit of your path on your website, but like it was playing for you, right? You were in conservatory, and did you, had you been into woodworking as a child, or was your family into it, or how did that happen for you?
I wasn't into woodworking, but my family was into metalwork. So I was around people who made stuff and crafted some great things. But for me, it actually started with my bass teacher, my double bass teacher. When I asked him, what's the difference between a bass with its nice pointy corners or with these hanging shoulders? Mm-hmm. And he said, there's no difference. From the inside, it's all the same. And then I didn't really... let's say that question didn't really bring me the answer I was looking for. So I started reading about it, and then I discovered that there was something like a real instrument maker, because by then I was just using the basses from music schools and stuff like that. Then I was studying at school. I don't know, the school you do between 12 and 18. I don't know how it's called in the US.
Sure, we call it high school here, but yeah.
High school, yeah. Well, I was combining modern sciences with ancient Greek. And by studying ancient Greek, it really opened up a very broad cultural domain for me, because there's just so much hidden in these texts. And the combination of that with a very good and a very, I shall say, passionate teacher, together with the music, brought it all together for me. That when I reached the age of 17 or 18, 17, and people started to ask me, "Hey, what are you gonna do? You think you're gonna go to university, or maybe you want to study languages, or you want to study politics or anything?" I really started to think what I wanted to do, and I didn't really felt that I fit in any of these corners, I would say. And then all of a sudden, I thought back about this instrument making thing about years ago, the question about the corners and no corners, and I started getting into that. I visited some luthiers, violin makers, who explained me a bit about the craft, and it all looked so magical for me. And then I visited a school for instrument making, where the magic was immediately cut down, which was very good for me. I mean, they were immediately very straight. I say, okay, good. Do you know how to use a plane? No. Okay, then probably you have to start with learning how to make something flat. And this will take you 3 weeks. And then we're going to go to something square, and this will take you another 3 weeks. And so all the magic was gone there from the start. But I started preparing for that, and I realized that it kind of worked. It seemed to work. And my concept was, I'm just gonna go there, and if I pass the entrance exam, then I'll start. And if I don't pass the entrance exam, then I don't start. Because the entrance exam was quite extensive, since you didn't only have to do woodworking, but you also had to do music theory. You had to sing notes, intervals, all these different that you had to play, all these aspects, which I think is great. But yeah, I passed. I did all the years, and that was the thing. I mean, that's how I rolled in. My father didn't like it, to be honest.
Oh, really?
My father is a sculptor. He sculpts in stone, metal as well, occasionally. And when I told him about it, he was like, "You're not going into the arts." Like, he knew the world, and he didn't think it was a good idea. But now he fully appreciates it, and he supports me in what I do for the full 120%. So it's great. What about yourself?
Yeah, it's so interesting how parents who are in the arts oftentimes are wary about that, or sometimes it's like all their kids go into the arts. Yeah, my parents were. I'm like one generation removed from the arts. I have musicians in the family. My mom and dad were teachers, so they were supportive, but they were supportive but concerned about my choice to go to music school, particularly here in the States. It's not cheap, with our setup. So I'm glad I did what I did, but they were hoping I would go into something with a little bit more of a clear future, but they were happy how it worked out.
Yeah. They've seen that you've done fine, and now they accept it.
Well, that's something.
No Christmas parties.
Well, yeah. It's something that I've definitely taught a fair amount in my life, and I've talked to a lot of very concerned parents whose kids want to go to music schools. And it's funny, if I look back, I'm in my mid 40s, so I started teaching in my mid 20s. So I've taught long enough to like see generations of kids, see like what happens. And I was very pessimistic in my mid 20s. I thought like, oh, nobody can make it in the arts. It's like, and especially if we're thinking orchestral performance, and if we're narrowing it down to the United States, where we, I think statistically like maybe 2 or 3% of people land full-time jobs who go to music school. I mean, it's kind of a crazy model if you really think about it in terms of numbers. But over the years, I started to see, oh wow, everybody kind of finds something to do that they're passionate about, and maybe they make it into an orchestra, maybe they don't. A lot more of them did than I expected, but I have yet to see somebody who was really sincerely committed to and fascinated by whatever aspect of music it was that didn't figure it out. So, it might not be as clear a job as like my wife's a doctor, and it's like you go to medical school and you do this, and it's hard, but there is a clear a clear slot for you. That's less so in the arts, certainly, but I don't know. I've become much more optimistic as I've gotten older, or maybe just more foolish as I've gotten older. But I've seen so many success stories that I paint a rosier picture these days.
Yeah. But I think that's pretty close to the truth what you're saying. At least in my experience as well. But a lot of it comes from dedication, I feel. And also you have to have the possibility to grow, or the possibility to do it, or the financial method, because I do have colleagues in instrument making that had to quit instrument making because of financial problems. Yeah. Okay, that's live, and then sometimes it can go wrong. That's very sad, of course. So these are the less glamorous stories. But I also have friends, instrument making friends, that are so passionate about it and manage to get these great funds to get financial support in this way to really keep, because it costs a gigantic amount of money to open a workshop. I mean, you need to have some good wood to start off with, and good wood is expensive. But all these things, financial support aside, that doesn't bring anything when you're not passionate or when you're not dedicated, I think. For instance, now it's here now 7 in the evening, 7 p.m. In Belgium, and I'm still in the workshop, and I didn't plan on leaving before or my girlfriend comes and gets me, or before 10 or 11 p.m. Because that's about my daily rhythm. It's to start at 8 and to finish at 11. And when I say this to people who have nothing to do with music or with arts, they can't truly understand it. They always consider me crazy, especially when I say I do it 7 days a week. They don't get the point. But for me, because it's something I really love to do, I truly get my food of life, so to say. I get it out of making the instruments and repairing the instruments, restoring the instruments, setting them up, playing, talking to musicians, all these things, that it doesn't feel like working. Not at all.
Yeah, that's that artistic passion, that artistic lifestyle, I think can be so hard for people to understand. And you're reminding me of, I live in this area of San Francisco. San Francisco is probably a bit closer to many European cities than other areas in the U.S., you know, very artistic and neighborhoody. And there's a wonderful art gallery. Elizabeth Ashcroft is the owner, and Live Worms Gallery is the place. And, you know, you see her in there all the time. She's morning, noon, and night, but then she's also out in the neighborhood and getting a coffee or getting a beer, you know, and chatting with people. And so it's this whole, you know, I think it's something that you're certainly, that is not a rare tale for people who build instruments, you know, to have a life like that. And so it's very different from the 9 to 5, Monday through Friday sort of lifestyle that I think a lot of people are accustomed to.
Definitely. It has nothing to do with a 9 to... I also wouldn't be happy in a 9 to 5 concept in instrument making. Mm-hmm. I've tried it. I really tried it because my girlfriend, she's wonderful. All my respect goes out to her. She's very concerned, and she wants to take care. And she says when I worked a bit too much, she said, you got to slow down a bit, you know, stop at 5, come with me, we'll cook, we'll have something to drink, and let's have a nice evening. I tried that for about 3 to 5 days, I think. And for these 3 to 5 days, it was fine, because it felt a bit like a holiday, like, all right, it's nice, it's chill. But after these 5 days, it just started creeping up on me. You know, I saw these basses, and yeah, I can't help it. It's something it's like a second nature. I need to do it some way or another. Yeah. It's a curse, but it's something great as well.
Right. Well, I think a lot of musicians can identify with that feeling, and it's funny. Me personally, my wife has very 9 to 5 kind of hours, and so I've for this my sort of work that I do, I try to keep it within that time. But then I also, not during pandemic times, but normally I do a lot of traveling, and then it's just like a totally different world, and it's, you know, out till 2 a.m. and moderate chaos, and so I have these waves of activity. But it's tough what you were describing with the just getting set up in an area for a shop. You know, that's something that people have really struggled with here in San Francisco. There's a wonderful luthier named Gael McCann who was here in San Francisco for about 7 years. He actually moved to France, not in Paris. He's outside. I forget exactly where he is. But because the cost of this city it's on par with Sydney and other places like that. It's just being like stupid expensive, and you can't really charge more to plane a fingerboard in San Francisco than you can in like rural America. And so he found himself working 7 days a week doing all kinds of repairs, but maybe not as inspired work as what you're describing. And so I think at a certain point he realized, like, let's just bail out of town. But it's a problem for us here. Like, we do have a couple of good options here, but for an area this large, you would think that there would be much more. But it's hard to do something, you know, like that and make it viable in this crazy town.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can truly imagine. Because I mean, I don't know how it's I don't know how it's like the climate in San Francisco. Is it very humid? Probably it is, isn't it?
It's ideal for instruments. It's about 50% humidity all year round, and it's I don't know exactly in Celsius, but it's like light jacket weather to like it's like pants and light jacket at all time. And there's no variability because you're right here. It's one of those Mediterranean climates, the coast, the influence of the Pacific Ocean. It just keeps things very stable. People have no idea what you're talking about when you say a winter post. They're a what? Why would you change your sound post? What would that? What need would you have for that? So.
Yeah, then for the musician, it's great to be in San Francisco. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. That's really cool. Because here in Belgium, it's quite different. I mean, we're kind of the country together with the UK. We're kind of known for having very variable weather. Lots of we can have the 4 seasons in one day. That's something that happens quite often here.
Yeah.
So here it's quite different, but that's cool. I didn't know that. Thank you.
It's interesting. I'm overdue for a visit to Belgium as this pandemic eases up. I know it's been a bit rocky in Europe and things are coming and going, but hopefully, finally here in the States, we've been like the worst at this, but finally we've been vaccinated, so things are getting better. But I'm long overdue for a trip to Brussels. I actually right before the pandemic, I was in Leeds in the UK in February, and it was the cheapest flight I've ever gotten in my life, and I thought, why is it so cheap? And I realized, Leeds in February. No one's, that's probably not like the time of year that people want to go to the UK.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. I can imagine the booker must have been sure that that's not a touristic visit. That's not for the beach or anything. It's the beaches in Leeds, I wouldn't even.
No, not unless you want to have your beach on the river. But it was cheaper than like flying within the United States, and I think it's just like it's probably not a destination. But I have been fascinated by Belgium. I'm a huge Belgian beer fan, and I was so sad we had this wonderful place La Trappe here in San Francisco that closed. Hopefully they'll reopen after the pandemic. But I've spent much time looking forward to a trip to Belgium, so hopefully we'll make it happen soon.
Yeah, come over. We'll have a beer. We'll have multiple beers.
Okay, sign me up.
Yeah, I'm very proud of the Belgian beer culture. It's a bit of the only thing we have internationally is our beer culture. So it's something to support, I think.
It is, and it's like one of the best Belgian beer bars in the United States. I used to live in Chicago, and it was a place that kicked off what we call the gastropub sort of. I'm sure that you have so many of these same places, but like a pub atmosphere, but with like a little bit fancier food. It's like now you find them in malls, but it was like a little bit of a novelty in the early '90s. And this place, they were like, no, we're doing nothing but Belgian beer, and people in the U.S. at that point were like, what? But this place, it was ahead of its time. It made the papers. Nationally, certainly. And so, yeah, I've been Belgium's been on my mind, over a pint or two, many a year.
That's great. That's truly great. Because I used to work in Vienna, and Vienna is a city quite different. I mean, it's very cultural. On one hand, it's very classical. Very chic, so to say, on one hand. But on the other hand, it's of course just still a big city with poverty and everything that comes with it, which for me was very interesting to see the two parts of it. But there, I mean, I had never been to Vienna before I went to work there. So it was a kind of a blind spot, but the whole concept that, I mean, we in Belgium, we are known for our French fries and our beers, but that's about it. There, they have the culture halls, they have these great concert halls, this music things, but it's all so long ago, and that was something that fascinated me because they can keep up with these things that are so old, but still keep it living because of that. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's something that I think about all the time in cultural hubs of Europe. That's something we think about in the States here, where the oldest thing in this town here is 1851. And we're like, whoa, 1851. Whoa,
It's recent.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Then you go somewhere, even like that trip to Leeds, you're like, everything is before 1851, and that's something that has always struck me when I visited, whether it's, Moscow or St. Petersburg or various places in Germany, and just like it's like, I remember particularly in Russia, it's like, oh, there's Shostakovich's grave. Oh, there's the building Shostakovich lived in when he wrote his Seventh Symphony, and I think Vienna, it's just dripping with that. And so, yeah, it's so interesting. I imagine it can be a bit stifling, the weight of that history. That's something that's kind of freeing about a place like the United States, is we don't have that. That makes us maybe a bit less cultural, certainly, but it's a beautiful thing too.
Yeah, sure, definitely. What I found very fascinating, I still do find it fascinating. But for instance, in Vienna, when we had an instrument coming in, like for instance a Matthias Thier, or these old great Viennese makers, Stadelmann, Thier, Leidolf, you could see a year written on a label and realize, oh, that's the year that war started, or that war ended, or in the middle of that. And I always found it so fascinating to think that an instrument maker had, and then you see this wonderful bass on your table, like flamed wood, like a complete disco, and spruce grown so tight that you could make seven violins out of one part just because it's so nice grain, but used for a bass. Great aesthetics in the middle of wartime. Mm-hmm. And I think, how is this possible? Well, it's possible because the emperors had gigantic amounts of money and they bought the bass for the chapel, for the music chapel back then. Maybe because of a marriage or something. Mm-hmm. But to imagine the times, how difficult it must have been. Can you imagine that and these days the warfare was not like now. I mean, okay, good, when you're in a country with warfare, it's horrible, obviously, no doubt about it. Mm-hmm. But back then it must have been quite different, especially because there was not much communication with the rest of the world. So when you were in Vienna, and Vienna was at war, you probably were quite personally at war, so to speak. There was no way you were going to get around it. Mm-hmm. And can you imagine them making basses? I mean, shouldn't you have been busy with, I don't know, baking bread or something necessary to live? Or no, seemingly not. Great instrument.
And it seems crazy, but that how cool that those are the things that endure, the art, these instruments that you're actually seeing something from that time period. It's
yeah, definitely. My workshop here is located between the actual living place and the burial place of Peter Bruegel the Oude, Peter Bruegel the Elder. I don't know in English. You know the painter, right? Bruegel. I don't know how you say it in English.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, Peter Bruegel de Oude. Flemish speakers will understand and will know. One of the most famous painters back in the days, together with Vermeer and Van Eyck. And it's interesting for me to have a workshop right in between his burial place and his what used to be his living place, or his atelier, because these were the same streets. And I find it so fascinating to see, because back then the times were so different.
Yeah.
You had invaders. Belgium has been invaded by the Spanish, well, the Romans at first, obviously, and then we had the Spanish, we had the French, the Germans, of course. I mean, the Austrians. We have been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is broadly said, but because Emperor Charles V was born in Ghent in Belgium, all of that together makes, when it comes to the arts, for very interesting influences. Yeah. I'm a bit fascinated by paintings because, as an instrument maker, wood is one part, but then there's varnish, right? And varnish by itself is pretty colorless. You can make it with color cooked inside it, but let's say standardly it's pretty colorless. And then to make the pigments that go inside of it, because I make everything myself. I make my varnish, I make my pigments. That for me was such an interesting part, to connect with these old painters, because that's the way I researched. I mean, I learned it at school how to make the basics, but it never stops at school, right? You continue. And then reading treatises about paint making in the 16th century, pigment making in the 17th century, visiting art galleries to see paintings that have been painted with pigments like that, where they used vermilion, where they used madder, where they used cochineal in their paintings, was for me so valuable, because these are traditions that were lost, completely lost, but for them were an extremely important part in their daily life. Mm-hmm. So I think paintings from these old areas are extremely important when you do your research as an instrument maker. Have you ever heard about the paintings of Evaristo Bastianis?
I have a bit, yeah. But remind me.
He used to paint these very realistic depictions of musical instruments back in his day. I think he was located not that far from Brescia. And the instruments you see on there, that's really interesting when it comes to iconography. So the study of paintings and images to use in historical research for musical instruments. Because there's not 100% guarantee. It's not because an instrument has been painted in a picture that it really was like that. There's no 100% guarantee, because a painter could have been a painter without any knowledge of musical instruments. He could have asked an instrument maker in town, like, give me some old instruments that you don't use anymore or that are not working or anything. Just bring them over to my photo studio, painting studio, painting atelier, and I'll use them as decoration. So they're not 100% accurate. It's not because they're depicted that they were really played. But there is something about it that is to keep in mind, that at least they existed. And therefore, there's quite a chance that they have been played. And that's very interesting as a researcher and then as an instrument maker.
Bram, thank you for the great chat. Folks, check him out on his website, which has a great URL. It's doublebass.be. And you can find that in the show notes. Definitely a pleasure. Can't wait to do a round 2 in person. All right. What is new? Boy, a lot is new since I last recorded these intros and outros. I just got back from a full week of bass goodness. The Roboth Institute Los Angeles, Celito de Jesus' event. So cool, so much fun, so great to be able to play with people in person. Again, that was my first time playing double bass outside of my place since March 2020. And boy, that was fun. I landed in Long Beach, and within an hour, I was playing bass quartets with David Young, Celito, and Ted Botsford. I'm putting together footage for YouTube for that. I brought my camera. I brought my lenses. I went to that event and to Wabass directly after that in Wabash, Indiana. And I have hours and hours and hundreds of gigabytes of footage that I'm going to be going through as soon as I finish these intros and outros. So better be brief on this outro here. But boy, what an inspiring event the Roboth Institute was. What an inspiring event Wabass was. So much more to share on that soon. I'm taking a recovery day here and just sort of catching up and doing laundry and going to the grocery store and all that sort of stuff and wrapping up podcasts for the next couple of weeks. So expect to hear more about that soon. But I guess I better wrap up here and get to that because I'm realizing how much work I have on that. Thank you for listening. If you have not subscribed to the podcast, and subscribing is free, by the way. I think Apple Podcasts is now calling it following, and Spotify is calling it following. So maybe I should say follow the podcast or whatever you want to do. It's free. Anywhere you get podcasts, we are there. We have an app if you are into apps for listening to podcasts, and that might be a good thing to think about for this particular podcast because we have so much content. It makes it really easy to search for a person or a topic and save certain episodes and all that kind of good stuff. And we have bonus stuff in the app. I don't know why I'm pushing the app so hard these days. I haven't really talked about it a lot recently, but it's a cool app, I think. And let me know. And I've thought about doing more with the app. And building out more features and putting more info in there. I don't know. Maybe I will at some point in the future. If you want more from the app or just want to say hi in general, reach out to me at feedback@contrabassconversations.com. I love hearing from folks. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Mitch Mooring, and Trevor Jones. Mitch makes beautiful basses in Kilgore, Tellis. Oh boy, I'm not going to edit it. Take two. Beautiful basses in Kilgore, Texas. That's a couple hours east of Dallas, Fort Worth. Doing wonderful work, award-winning basses, and you can learn more at mitchmooring.com. I am your host, bravely getting through these outros, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more Life at the Low End of the Spectrum.